So my story, thank you for the introduction. I did spend a lot of time in the woods, particularly once I moved out west. And I intuitively was attracted to the plants, but I didn't intuitively learn. I actually took classes and I studied very, very heavily for a number of years. But it kind of starts when I was a kid, and I was a suburban kid. I use the term street in my description of the talk, but I was a suburban kid. I grew up in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from here. And I was a child of a father who had just been in Vietnam and a mother who had this incredible intuition. Actually, she wouldn't call herself a psychic, but she definitely had visions. And I grew up with an understanding that that was a real thing. And sadly, over time, that ability to have incredible intuition about people and energy around her led her to become somewhat depressed, actually, because she was too sensitive. And I think she's, in a healthier place now, but having been around having a father who had been in a very terrible place for a long time and carrying some of that energy with him, and a mother who was so sensitive to the energies of the world around her, I think prepared me for a life of greater intuition and connection to people and places that I think has benefited me and also is benefiting people that I'm working with to some extent. So as a child of the suburbs, I grew up next to a highway with another highway on the other side, but there was a little patch of trees and a little creek that was between us and the highway. And so I spent a lot of time in those woods, searching for crawdads in the creek and jumping up and down this little hill that was actually, I think, just a pile of rubbish that was piled up maybe that had trees down growing out of it, and we would sled down it. And now that I look at it as an adult, it's maybe 20 feet tall. So that was our little mountain, and I had felt peace in that place, that tiny little woodlot. And so when I got older and wanted to, like so many kids at the time, want to get out of the suburbs and move to the city, I carried that with me, but in some ways rejected it. So I was attracted to Philadelphia, having grown up there. My mother was from South Philly, so I knew it very well and went to college there. But it was during the crack epidemic, and so it was a pretty rough time in the city. And so I went to Temple, so I was living in North Philadelphia and stepping on crack files in between classes, and really, really not a good time in the city. And I also became a little bit too sensitized and felt depressed by the time I was finishing school and needed something different. So I decided to sign up for the AmeriCorps program, which was like a domestic program that I called a domestic Peace Corps. Very short term, and you could go work with a community somewhere in the country, and you applied to go to different places. So I applied to many, many places all over the West Coast. And the only one that got back to me, I actually was supposed to be with one organization that ended up losing their funding. So very last minute, I applied to a number of organizations, and the one that got back to me was in Wairika, California, which is very, very north, right at the border of Oregon. And the person hiring me for a social work position, that was my degree, said that you don't really want to live in Wairika. There's not really a lot of young people here, and the ones that are not the healthiest. There was a very methamphetamine was the problem at the time. And there's a little town called Ashland, which is a little farther north. So I ended up moving to Ashland, Oregon, which is an environmental fantasy land. It's beautiful. The Pacific Crest Trail comes through there. They have the Shakespeare Festival all 9 months out of the year. It's a fairly wealthy community, so there's a lot of resources. There's a college there. I mean, it has all the things. Meanwhile, I'm working and driving over a mountain every day to get to this community where there was devastation, very much like the community I came from. So, but a different group of people. So I saw these connections between the devastation of the economic situations and what it led to in families and people. And to me, it was all the same. And over time, I became more interested in the way we can live in this beautiful, amazing place and yet have this kind of a devastation with people. So over time, I was feeling also homesick, and the place that I felt the most at home was in the woods. And so I spent a lot of time wandering along where the Pacific Crest Trail connected, and just spending more and more time outdoors and wanting to know what these plants around me were. They looked so different from what I came from. It was high desert ecosystem, so it's a very different than a temperate rainforest that I was used to. And so little by little, I wanted to learn, and I didn't really know who to ask. I was such a city kid, really, at the time. I didn't really know where to go or so I bought some books. Yul Gibbons had a book. I don't know if you're familiar with Yul Gibbons, Stalking the Wild Asparagus. Yes. And then there was a book that was written in the 80s by Michael Tierra, who was an herbalist in the Bay Area. And I had his book, and I literally memorized the whole thing. And I started telling people, oh, well, you have a headache? Rosemary. Yes. Use these books to help other people, but I didn't really know what I was doing or what I was talking about. Things like I remember one of my roommates at the time, he had a toothache. So I took some cloves and I wrapped them in a little piece of gauze, and I said, suck on this and it's going to make your mouth numb. It kind of does. I mean, I was getting some positive feedback, but I also had no idea what I was doing. So I found that there was this herbalist. The internet had just started to become a thing. This was in the mid-90s. So I searched online for herbal learning. I don't even know that I knew the term herbalist at the time, but I searched online for herbal learning, and I found there was an herb teacher in Eugene. And I reached out to him. I want to learn. And that's exactly what I titled the email. I had just gotten an email. I want to learn. And he wrote back, I do interviews in September. So I went to Eugene. I interviewed with this herbalist guy. And I ended up spending the next few years with him. And he would take me and a number of other students into the woods, into the Cascade Mountains, for a day, sometimes days at a time. And we would learn about botanical identification, and we would harvest plants, but that didn't happen until much later in the training. And it was a very deep dive into ecology, into human-plant interaction, into how to become someone that's trustworthy, working with plants with other people, and also how to become an advocate for the environment, really. That's ultimately what working with plants molds you into becoming. And so I just kind of followed one foot in front of the other for year after year after year. And as I'm going through this, I'm also having to support myself somehow. Mm-hmm. So I always had these jobs that were kind of always on the side. And so I was working in human services. I worked in group homes, and I ended up working with a research organization in Eugene that did studies of people that had been in foster care and then follows them through their lives, and then did these intensive behavioral interventions. And so I interviewed people. It's pretty much what I did. So I learned a lot about people. And I also became increasingly interested in what kinds of impacts the environment around them has on how they turn out as people. I guess it's a crude way to say it, but I was particularly working with prisoners at one point, and I was interested in their nutrition and how did poor nutrition as children lead to them to be in this prison cell. And I didn't know enough. And herbalism wasn't answering those questions for me either. So I decided to go back to school, and I looked into nutrition programs. I looked into medical school, but nursing just seemed the easiest and the fastest way, and also the most flexible way to learn more about people and also still practice my herbalism. So I went to nursing school, moved back to the East Coast because I was missing family. I'd met my husband, Eric, there when I was in Eugene. And all this time, he's watching me learn more about plants and become more and more enmeshed in this herbal world. And leaving Eugene meant also leaving my herbal community and my teachers. But in part, moving back here was going to allow me to define a new path. And part of that was going back to school and learning more about nursing, and then also following where that takes me. And I ended up working in critical care for almost 14 years, hospice for actually critical care. And then I worked in hospice care, and in hospice is where I found my people. I loved my coworkers in hospice. And actually one of my coworkers was someone who graduated from this program. She was a chaplain. So that was how I heard of this organization. And while I was in hospice was the first time I was able to then bring back my herbalism into my world of nursing. And all of the time that I was working in nursing, I felt a push-pull with how we did things in conventional medicine. And there could be a better way. And why don't we do this? But I wasn't trying to fight it too much because I was in the system. And I would try to provide maybe some education about, for example, foods, and not necessarily herbal things, but nutritional advice and things like that that I could give within my role without stepping too far out of it. But increasingly, the only way I felt to make a true difference was to create the world that I wanted to live in. And so, and my husband also felt the same way. And so ultimately we started our own farm here in Doylestown after moving back. We had been interested in, organic food, and I was interested in quality plants to work with, and interested in people that had a similar worldview, and we just weren't finding it here. And so when we decided to start a small organic farm, people came to us. We created that little community, and it just started to form. And so over the course of, well, it's now been 16 years we've been farming. Over the last 16 years or so, we have been able to kind of create a community of people that support each other, and also allow me to live a life that I feel good about, and work with plants more intensively. And now I teach about plants with other people. And my husband and I are able to make decisions on a daily basis about what the next step is, instead of having it be dictated to us. And primarily what I have come to in my role as both a nurse and an herbalist, kind of a bridge walker, I feel as though I am, is to provide a safe place for people to come and share what's going on with them. But also I can help with a non-judgmental way, because I feel as though there's a lot of judgmentalness within the natural health scene. And there's also a lot of judgment inside of the orthodox treatment. So I see all of that, and I want to be the safe place, provide for a safe place for people to explore options that are available to them. And so for me, what I see my role as is in the scheme of things, and talking about the universe and this where I find my little speck of dust myself, that ultimately many specks of dust in the world right now, is I am just one of millions who are connected through a lineage that we are all a part of. We've evolved with plants. We've evolved connected closely to the earth. And we've gotten so far from that we have to force ourselves to try to find it again. And that's what I feel as though I'm trying to help facilitate, helping people foster that connection that they otherwise have as a birthright. We all have as a birthright connection to the natural world. We are part of the natural world. As much as we like to separate ourselves from it, we are part of the natural world. We are an expression of the natural world. And my role in the world, I think, what it's become is a facilitator of that connection for other people. And so, so that's basically my story. I don't know if I talked for a whole 20 minutes or if I went over. But yeah, so that's, I love plants. I love plant medicine. I love people. And I think any way that we can kind of get everyone on board with appreciating plants and the worlds in which they come from, which is the one we share, creates more advocates for the natural world. And so I think that the more people learn about plant medicine, the more we have environmentalists and advocates for the world generally.